I missed a day yesterday, you guys. I'm sorry. The what matters is that I'm back. Okay. Chilly day in New York. I don't know why I always have to start with a preamble. Ooh. Okay, we're on chapter 4. The title of chapter 4 is called Burning. I've been really exposing myself for a few bad habits. Like you guys see that I get Dunkin' Donuts coffees like 3 days a week. And I wear this sweatshirt a little too much, but it's chilly. I have other clothes on underneath. I just wear the same sweatshirt over. Okay. Another life update, which is not that important. I got a new lamp, and so that's why I am illuminated right now. Look at my new lamp. Okay. The power broker. It must have seemed like a great time to be young and a reformer in New York. In all American history, in fact, it would have been hard to find a better time. The young idealist entered public service in the very year in which there came to crest a movement, progressivism, that was based to an extent greater perhaps than any other nationally successful American political movement on an idealistic belief in man's capacity to better himself through the democratic process. An outgrowth of the agrarian populist crusade of the 1880s and 1890s, the progressive movement had been swelled before the turn of the century by the enrollment of America's urban middle class, its conscience awakened by Lincoln Steffens, Jacob Riis, I recognize that name because there's Riis Park, and other muckrackers who dramatized the poverty of the slums, and by the testimony of its own eyes, which could see all too well, in the horrors of child labor and the sweatshop, the problems that flowed from the new industrial order. In searching for the causes of these problems, progressives settled on the most easily identifiable, the giant corporations and corrupt political bosses who they felt had stolen mythical America away from its people. To exorcise these demons, to force a return from the political democracy and economic individualism that Americans were fond of, the individualism that Americans were fond of believing had once existed in their country, they advocated reforms equally simplistic, so simplistic, in fact, that they proved primarily that the old American impulse to do good was still intact. And they were reforms that a young man who wanted to do good, a young man like Bob Moses, could advocate with all his heart. One of the major demands of progressivism was one that he himself had called for in his PhD thesis: removal of the spoil system from the federal civil service. And if, in the thesis, he had discussed the need for great new departments of government to combat the excesses of industrialism, more and more the reformers were coming to demand intervention by government, the only St. George hefty enough to slay dragons of the size being bred in America. Okay, I can already tell this chapter is going to be better than the last one when he was at Oxford. I don't know why that was so boring to me. In 1913, the cheers for Wilson's New Freedom reform program were ringing from virtually every corner of the country except the bastions of privilege. In the state houses, it was the era of Altgeld of Illinois, of Pingree of Michigan. I'm from Michigan. I don't know who Pingree is. Of Charles Evans Hughes, exposer of corruption in New York's large insurance companies, and of Robert Marion La Follette, who broke the power of the railroads in Wisconsin and sponsored laws limiting working hours for women and children. It was the very height of an era of optimism and hope for America. As the time was right for Bob Moses, so seemingly was the place. If there was an epicenter of the idealism that was rolling across America, it was the 9th floor of 261 Broadway. The impulse to do good may have been rampant beneath the domes of state houses and the national capital, but it reached its zenith in city halls. Perhaps this was because in cities corruption was more visible than in federal politics, issues more succinctly dramatized. Or perhaps it was because the reforming impulse thrived on problems, and it was in the cities, swelling with the immigrant tide, faced with problems of housing, school policing, fire protection, traffic regulation, and the sewage disposal on a new scale, that America's problems were beginning to loom largest. Sorry, I just. Unlike European cities, which also mushroomed in the industrial age, but which had been built atop previous centuries' strong administrative foundations, America's had sprung into gianthood relatively overnight, often organizing around nothing but the factory or the mill. Oh, look who it is. Look who it is. She loves reading. I wish the camera showed her better, but she's looking at herself in the mirror. Often organized around nothing but the factory or the mill, and had no such tested governmental framework. What framework they did have, America, was undermined by blatant corruption, their governments controlled by private interests and by political bosses who, with their Christmas baskets and everything the baskets symbolized, marshaled hundreds of thousands of ignorant voters into vast, seemingly impregnable political machines. With very few exceptions, asserted historian Andrew D. White, the city governments of the United States are the worst in Christendom, the most expensive, the most inefficient, and the most corrupt. Oh my gosh, she really likes the new mirror. The new lamp. She always stops doing the thing right when I turn the camera. It's like, yeah. It's like that, I'm blanking on the name of the thing in physics that does that, where you can't photograph it. To combat these conditions, reform movements sprang up in almost every large city in the United States. And in no city was progressivism more vigorous than in New York. In New York, its spearhead was the Bureau of Municipal Research. To many observers, in fact, the Bureau was the spearhead of municipal reform not only in New York but throughout the United States. Historian Charles A. Beard was later to conclude that its methods constituted nothing short of a revolution in the approach to such matters. The three young men who had founded the Bureau in 1907, William H. Allen, Henry Brewer, and Frederick A. Cleveland, believed, as did the city's older reformers who had backed them financially, that the growth of forces which had diminished the individual's control over his own destiny had made it incumbent on government to ride to his rescue with increased welfare services. But this trio, known among reformers as the ABC, added to the reform ethos new elements derived from two other passions of the era, natural science and scientific management. The emphasis of natural science on empiricism, on first-hand observation, on the obtaining of facts, led them to conclude that it was vain to talk about changing the philosophy of government before learning the facts of government. And they said, therefore, that the first step toward reform should be analysis of government operations. From scientific management, the age was marveling at the assembly line techniques introduced by Henry Ford. They concluded that after government operations had been analyzed, the next step should be not a change in philosophy, but an improvement in such operations to make them efficient and economic, to ensure that the city would get far more for each dollar spent than in the past, and would therefore be financially more able to do what the voters desired. Their philosophy, seemingly so elementary, was new in 1907. Previously, in New York and in all American cities, reform crusades had been of the throw the rascals out variety. Stung to fury by particularly blatant corruption, good government, quote, good government, unquote, elements would rise up, oust the reigning political bosses, and seat in the mayor's chair a hero who they hoped would save the city. But salvation was invariably denied because the administrative systems of cities were so chaotic that change in the direction of government was all but impossible. Budget, for example, sorry about the train, was only a dictionary word. In turn of the century America, not a single city possessed one. That someone's got to look into that. No city had a budget in 1900. Allocating money with reference to the total amount available and to the relative urgency of the needs of the various city departments was therefore impossible. Scientific accounting techniques, only recently incorporated into American business, had never been adapted to government, so departmental requests for appropriations were not itemized, and therefore items could not be compared with the comparable expenditures in the past. In New York, for example, the Board of Estimate made appropriations without even checking to see if there was or would be sufficient money available in the city's treasury to cover them. If money ran out, the board simply issued revenue bonds to make up the difference. Okay, I guess that makes sense. Departmental requests to the board were lump sum requests, which showed in only the most general way how the departments proposed to spend the money they were asking for. Unable to analyze these requests, the board simply cut each by the same predetermined percentage, a procedure which some departments circumvented by requesting 5 times as much money as they really needed. It's a good chapter so far. I'm turning on the heater. Sorry. Sorry, it was kind of hard to plug in. Okay, there we go. Wow, I cannot believe cities had no budgets. That's crazy. Given such administrative chaos, the careers of the reform heroes were predictable. In city after city, they failed to make an appreciable dent in municipal problems, and after a term or two, the rascals they had thrown out were back in. In New York, where the businessmen reformers of the Citizens Union had thrust Columbia University President Seth Low into mayoralty in 1902, Tammany had taken back City Hall in 1904. Said Brewer from the Bureau of Municipal Research, said Brewer, there was the constant futile search for the great administrator, great by instinct and personality. He wasn't found because he doesn't exist. A great administrator needs the tools and techniques of sound administration. The search, he said, should not be so much for good men as for these good tools and techniques. The idea should not be so much to jail the grafters as to install in government business systems which will make grafting difficult. Before government could become humanitarian, he said, it must become businesslike. The city's businessmen listened to the ABC and put up the money so that they could go to work. Confident that if the citizenry only knew the facts about government, it would take the right steps, the three young men decided first to determine and disseminate such facts. Momentarily stymied by the refusal of notoriously corrupt Manhattan Borough President John F. Ahern to show them his records, they began to check records that could not be hidden, the construction contract specifications that borough presidents were required by law to publish in newspapers, to see if the specifications were being followed. Construction workers began to notice the presence of young men in high collars, vests, and bowler hats who spent whole days performing such inexplicable maneuvers as counting bags of cement. When the count was finished, the young men had discovered and proved that the city had, in collusion with favored contractors, paid for hundreds of thousands of dollars of supplies such as bags of cement, that had never been delivered. The Bureau of Municipal Research published its first report, How Manhattan is Governed. That is so interesting, and I want to read it. I'm just going to underline it. I have really become a pencil reader lately. That's me. I spend my whole day performing inexplicable maneuvers. What is life if not a series of inexplicable maneuvers, punctuated by a few explicable ones? In the time-honored ploy of politicians whose party is in power, Ahern demanded an official investigation, assuming that it would be conducted by Tammany faithful. Unknown to him, however, Mayor George B. McClellan, Jr. had just decided to break with Tammany. McClellan gave Ahern, also, I don't know how well this is known among everyone, but Tammany Hall, I actually really need to look this up on Wikipedia, but Tammany Hall was like a political posse back in the day in New York. But you should look it up. It's probably interesting. I just don't know enough about it. There were like riots and stuff because Tammany didn't get what they wanted sometimes. I don't know. McClellan gave Ahern the investigation he had asked for, but the man appointed to conduct it was an independent 28-year-old Yale graduate and lawyer, John Perroy Mitchell. Mitchell confirmed the Bureau's findings. City Club President George McEnany, ignoring Tammany pressures on his business, volunteered to deliver Mitchell's report personally to Governor Hughes with his own endorsement, and Hughes summoned Ahern to public hearings in Albany. At the hearings, Ahern said he didn't know anything about the contracts. Hughes said he should have and removed him from office. As the businessmen reformers hastily established a fund to make the Bureau a permanent institution, the ABC started counting bags of cement in the Bronx and Queens, a mathematical exercise which would result in the removal from office of the presidents of both those boroughs. The offices of the Bureau were filled with excitement. The ABC, young themselves, gathered around them a group of recent university graduates determined to reform municipal government. They had a sense of mission. One, writing a history of the Bureau, said that there was in it not a little romance. Said another, the men in training were looking for adventure, and most of them found it. The young men developed technique. When they say not a little romance, I really am actually completely unsure whether that means like a lot of romance or not even a little bit. None at all. I really couldn't tell you. But based on context, I would guess that it's a lot of romance. The young men developed techniques that were to reform every aspect of municipal government and create a new literature on the science of public administration. They devised the first budget used by any municipal government unit, a primitive model employed by the New York City Health Department in 1908. They invented line-by-line itemization to eliminate lump sum budget requests, an organization chart similar to those coming into use in business to make responsibility easier for voters to pinpoint. When enthusiastic press support forced the Board of Estimate to adopt the Bureau's innovations, city departments, for the first time, had to show what they had spent money for in the past year and which items they wanted to increases for. And for the first time, citizens could understand and could judge a department's record. Tammany Hall called it the Bureau of Municipal Besmirch. But its exposés led to the election in 1909 of anti-Tammany reformer William J. Gaynor as mayor. And when reformers McEnany and William A. Prendergast were elected to borough presidencies, they reorganized their offices along lines the Bureau suggested. Welcome to a couple people just joined. Okay, basically we're on chapter 4 and young Robert Moses is not even mentioned yet. We're just talking about the background of New York City, and basically it got a lot of administrative upgrades in like the first 10 years of the 1900s. Because before it had no budget at all, and there was a lot of fraud and corruption. And so it's the background of that. In 1911, the Bureau founded its training school for public service, the first educational institution in the U.S. dedicated solely to preparing young men for work in government. The young idealists of the era of optimism saw in it a chance to obtain training in a field in which their idealism could be most easily translated into effective action. By 1913, there were hundreds of applicants for its handful of places. Bob Moses was one applicant for whom a place was waiting, since his mother was a cousin of one of the Bureau's trustees, Columbia professor Edwin R. A. Seligman, and a friend of several others. When he finished his thesis, he was allowed to enroll immediately and was told to share one of the tables that served as desks with a student named Medor, and was taken on the tour of City Hall. That was the student's introduction to municipal government. Hold on, I'm going to do some Googling after this because Medor is my boyfriend's mom's maiden name, so I'm going to see if there's any connection there. Also, Nepo baby. In theory, even his own theory, Moses should have been happy at the Bureau. With its concentration on the improvement of the mechanics of government, it was, after all, addressing itself to concerns that he had expressed in his thesis. The admission policy of the training school, moreover, answered the main demand of the thesis, the need for university men in public service. Only applicants of the most impeccable scholastic backgrounds were accepted. Moses understood this. In his thesis, he had written that the Bureau and its training school were the system of the future in American cities. But once he became part of the training school, it didn't take Moses long to decide that the system of the future wasn't going to be his future. In the field of public administration, the training school was unique in its down to earth practicality. Pupils not only were put through intensive reading courses on the theory of budget making, accountancy, scientific management, chart making, and the use of forms, summaries, and statements, but also spent long days in city offices watching budgets actually being made up and did their scientific management homework sitting in city offices trying to figure out ways to eliminate unnecessary personnel and analyzing projects the city was undertaking to see if they really were needed. They did the legwork for the Bureau members who were heading the investigations, which would result in exposure of corruption or waste in city government. The students were filled with a spirit so strong that it seemed sometimes as if it must surely waft out of the windows of 261 Broadway and melt some of the soot from the blackened granite of the Tweed Courthouse below. That is really a fun sentence. They believed in the importance of what they were doing. A half-century later, rheumy eyes would light up and smiles would curl corners of wrinkled lips as they talked about it. And they talked in terms of old soldiers reserved for old battles. Quote, how would I sum up what we were doing? One would say, we were fighting to make democracy work. That's what we were doing. They were very proud of their position in the army of idealism. They idolized their leaders, ABC, Allen, Brewer, and Cleveland. They knew were the very men who had charged through a hail of public abuse and private threats to pull down 3 Tammany chieftains. Who knew what victories over corruption might not be won through the use of the information they were collecting in their daily reconnaissance through the files of City Hall. Watching John Burroy Mitchell stride by their tables to confer with his friend Brewer, they whispered to one another that they hoped the young lawyer would decide to accept the Fusion nomination for mayor. The 9th floor bubbled with excitement. You couldn't walk in there without getting an assignment, recalls one training school student. You'd open the door and someone would yell, hey, glad to see you. Get up a memorandum on this. And you'd go back out the door, and over to City Hall without even taking off your hat. For a while, Moses seemed at home in this atmosphere. He did the legwork, wrote the memos, joined the other training school students for 20-cent lunches at Child's, and for their one big splurge of the week, a 6-course Sunday dinner at Luchow's, which might cost as much as $1.25. He didn't interrupt, as they didn't interrupt, when one of the older Bureau staffers was telling again the story of how everybody in the Bureau had jumped to his feet and cheered on the day that a reporter brought the news that Governor Hughes had just announced that the charges against Ahern merited a public hearing. Totally forgot who Ahern is. At first, he was very popular with the other students. Moses. He was pleasant and friendly and had a gift for putting people at ease. Many of the students admired Moses. Those from big Midwestern universities were new to New York and slightly awed by the big city. Moses obviously knew his way around. Moreover, most of them were struggling along on students' allowances, and they knew he came from a wealthy family. They were thinking about what they were going to do after graduation from the training school, and they knew Moses would be able to choose his job without regard for financial considerations. In the late afternoons, when they were all heading for the subway for the ride home, they watched him grab a taxicab. Occasionally, they might be talking about an opera they had seen the night before, having been lucky enough to secure standing room tickets, and they would ask Moses if he had seen it. Oh yes, he would say, his family had a box. But the young idealist admired Moses most for his education. It wasn't just that he had been to Yale, the world's principal centers of education for public service were Oxford and the University of Berlin, and Moses had studied at both. Now he was attending the most advanced school for public administration in the United States. One of his friends wondered, quite seriously, whether Bob Moses was not the man best educated in public administration in the whole country. Within a few months, however, the students began to notice another quality in Moses, a quality which became more apparent almost day by day. Blazing behind big gray eyes, they now saw was a furious impatience. Within moments after entering the training school, Moses made clear that he felt he had learned all it had to offer. He was irritated by the report cards, by the weekly conferences with his bureau advisors, by all the aspects of school life that made him remember that it was a school and that he was still, at the age of 25, a student. If you're just coming in, Robert Moses, before he becomes a city official, he's in this like training school in New York. And there's a lot of idealism there. And they're really into analyzing things and finding fraud. In particular, he resented the legwork. The training school men were required to summarize the results of their investigations in memos that had to be written as if they were official bureau reports, but that would actually be seen only by the bureau men who were writing the real reports that would be published. Moses wanted his memos published. He began to press for admission to the bureau itself, making clear that because he had an allowance from his mother, he would require no salary. Within a year, on that financial basis, he was admitted. His student days were over. That is crazy that he just worked for free. And he got the job because his mom knew them. The impatience was not slacked. No sooner was he in the bureau than he began to make cutting comments about its procedures. The voluminous filing and cross-filing of all information was a waste of time, he said. The weekly staff luncheons were a waste of time. The bureau's constant emphasis on procedure was a waste of time. The bureau wasn't getting enough done, he said. But it was becoming apparent to many of his colleagues that the bureau would never be able to get enough done to satisfy Moses, no matter how many technicalities it dispensed with, simply because the bureau was merely an agency that investigated and advised government. The way to get things done, Moses was making clear, was to be in government. Through Bella, his mom, he had a nodding acquaintance with several members of Mayor Gaynor's administration. He began to neglect his work at the bureau and spend more and more time at City Hall, hanging around their offices. His colleagues began to whisper about Bob Moses. The slang of the era contained a phrase that described what they thought he was doing. He was, they whispered, pushing his acquaintance at City Hall. There was an adjective heard frequently in the whispers, too. The adjective was ambitious. Bob Moses, the idealist of the bureau said, was interested, much too interested, in making a name for himself. And that he did. But if there was ambition, there was only a part of what was driving Bob Moses. And the whisperers never saw the other part, for they never saw what Moses did in the late afternoons after he grabbed the taxicabs. Sometimes, of course, Moses would tell the cab driver to take him straight home. But oftentimes he would ask to be dropped off across the west side on Riverside Drive at the end of 76th Street near the Hudson River. And as he climbed out of the cab there, he climbed out into a scene far different from the doorman's serenity of Central Park West. The next part's crazy. He would be standing on the high bluff that was Riverside Drive. Behind him, as if he looked up, stately apartment houses would appear to be swaying over him against a backdrop of moving clouds, but he would be looking down. Below him, along the edge of the river, was a wasteland 6 miles long, stretching from where he stood all the way north to 181st Street. The wasteland was named Riverside Park, but the park was nothing but a vast low-lying mass of dirt and mud. Running through its length was the 4-track bed of the New York Central, which lay in a right-of-way that had been turned over to railroad by the city half a century before. Unpainted, rustling, jagged wire fences along the tracks barred the city from its waterfront. In the whole 6 miles, there were exactly 3 bridges on which the tracks could be crossed, and they led only to private boating clubs. Okay, so he's just staring at it. The engines that pulled trains along the tracks burned coal and oil. From their smokestacks, a dense black smog rose toward the apartment houses, coating windowsills with grit. The smog had an acrid odor, but people who lived in the apartments hardly noticed it. It was scarcely worth mentioning alongside the stench that seemed to hang over Riverside Drive endlessly after each passage of a train carrying south to the slaughterhouse in downtown Manhattan, carload after carload of cattle and pigs. When Despite the smell, Riverside Drive residents were driving by the heat to open their windows. They were kept awake at night by the clank and the couplings which hooked the cars together. If you hear the train outside my window, you can understand that. Walking in the park was adventure. The walker sank at intervals into the landfill of which it had been constructed, for water had eaten away at much of the fill from below. In many spots, it had broken through the crust of the fill to form little lakes. Every year, the park grew smaller as its edge crumbled into the river. Areas that were still solid had been appropriated by the railroad for wood-lined pits in which coal was piled. Lying along the river were heaps of rotting timbers stored years before by some city official, by some city department and forgotten. At 79th and 96th Streets, untreated garbage mounded toward the sky. The sanitation department used those areas as dumping grounds from which the garbage was transferred to SCOWS, SCOWS, don't know what that is. Someone should look it up. Sorry, I got lost because to SCOWS, which towed it out to the open sea. But somehow the rate of transfer was never fast enough to clear the refuse away entirely. Other solid spots held human refuse. Derelicts who had built tar paper shanty towns considered so dangerous that the police stayed away from them. At night, the open fires over which the derelicts cooked flickered in the darkness below the drive. Looking south, oh, it's a small type of barge. Thank you so much, Just Witty. Looking south, Moses could see the bluff stink and the park narrow until both disappeared, and houses, factories, and warehouses crowded close to the waterfront. The railroad tracks wended their way between the buildings, making several sharp curves, and then emerged on 11th Avenue, along which, at street level, trains inched their way in a straight line down to the foot of the island. In front of every train, to warn away pedestrians and drivers, rode a cowboy on a horse waving a large red flag. Since the trains came at frequent intervals and moved I want that to be my job. Since the trains came at frequent intervals and moved extremely slowly along the avenue, traffic was frequently backed up for blocks. Often the driver would become impatient and ignore the warning flag. For that reason, 11th had become known as Death Avenue. For years, the city had tried without success to find a solution to the problem posed by the presence of the railroad along the west side. In the late afternoons, as the sun sank toward the Palisades across the Hudson, Bob Moses walked along Riverside Drive. He walked down the steep paths to the park, over one of the bridges, across the tracks, and skirting the dirty tar paper shacks along the edge of the clear blue river. And as he walked, he dreamed. One Sunday in 1914, he was crossing the Hudson by ferry to picnic in New Jersey. With him were some college friends and their dates, one of whom was Frances Perkins, later to be United States Secretary of Labor. As the ferry pulled out into the river, Moses leaned on the rail, watching Manhattan spread out behind the boat. I'll probably only read the rest of this paragraph. Miss Perkins happened to be standing beside him, and suddenly she heard Moses exclaim, "Isn't this a temptation to you? Couldn't this waterfront be the most beautiful thing in the world?" As the woman looked at him in astonishment, words began to pour out of Bob Moses, and she realized that, quote, he had it all figured out. How you could build a great highway that went uptown along the water, how you'd have to tear down a few buildings at 72nd Street and bring the highway around a curve. He wanted places where people could leave their boats safely, public clubs, like private clubs. Staring back at the bleak mud flats, covered by a haze of smoke from the railroad engines, she heard Moses paint for her a picture of what the scene could be, like on a Sunday. The ugly tracks completely hidden by the great highway, cars traveling slowly along it, their occupants enjoying the view, and along the highway stretching green parks filled with strollers, tennis players, and families on bicycles. There would be sailboats on the river and motor yachts tied up in gracefully curving basins. And the thing that astonished her most, Miss Perkins was to recall, was that Bob Moses had the exact location of tennis courts and boat basins quite definitely in mind. The young bureau staffer beside her was talking about a public improvement on a scale almost without precedent in turn of the century urban America. An improvement that would solve a problem that had baffled successive city administrations for years. And he had it all figured out. Okay, well, that's where I'm gonna stop today. Thanks so much for watching. I am really excited about this chapter, and I'll be back tomorrow. I don't know what time though. I think that when I do this at 10 a.m. is a weird time. I like to do it later, like I did today. I'm in a better mood. I don't know. Okay. Thanks for coming. I don't know if this is interesting for you guys, but I like to read on the live stream. It's really fun to see your comments. Okay. Goodbye. Also, it keeps me more accountable.